Hey everyone, I'm Ben, the amateur exegete, and this is episode 77 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is Ephraim and the Exodus, a notable contradiction. I have been a fan of the cartoon The Simpsons for nearly my entire life. My dad didn't allow us to watch it when I was younger, but by the time I was a teenager, we would come home from church and watch the latest episode together. This was back when you had to either watch it live or tape it with your VCR and watch it later. One of my favorite scenes comes from the second season of the show. Homer has been given just 24 hours to live after he erroneously thinks he's consumed venom from a blowfish from a sushi restaurant. As his time on Earth draws to a close, he quietly gets up in the night, kisses his children goodbye, except for Bart, and resigns to the living room. He then picks from the bookshelf an audio version of the Bible read by the late Larry King, places it in his cassette player, and hits play.
It's a good book. On tape? Ooh, it's read by Larry King.
Hi, I'm Larry King. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without Zair beget Phineas. Phineas begat Abushua. And Abushua begat Ahimaaz. Ahimaaz begat Amariah. Onward. Amariah begats Ahitub. Ahitub begat Shalom begat Hilkiah. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. Well, that's it. My old friend Duke Zever's standing by. We'll get some coffee. We'll get some matzo ball soup. I love the San Antonio Spurs, by the way. If you're betting in the NBA this year, I think they're going to win it all. So I guess there's nothing more to say but...
What is there not to love about this scene? From Larry King opening a reading of Holy Writ with the words, "Hi, I'm Larry King," to Homer unceremoniously fast-forwarding through all those begats, to the patter after King finishes reading, including betting on the San Antonio Spurs to win the NBA Finals. It is a delightful blend of somberness and silliness. Those early seasons of The Simpsons sure were magical. If you're like me, you can certainly sympathize with poor Homer as he skips through the genealogies, avoiding name after name that hold so little meaning and so little interest for most readers of the Bible. Who cares who the father of Zibeon was, or who the descendants of Japheth were? Why do I need to know the names of the descendants of Reuben, or Simeon, or Issachar, or Benjamin? If you've spent any time reading through 1 Chronicles, you know well the pain of slogging through name after name after name in a section Robert Alter describes as the least readable extended passage in the Bible. While certainly dull, biblical genealogies are not without value. In Genesis, for example, early genealogies like those in chapters 5, 10, and 11 function not only as narrative devices, tying stories together by bridging time from one generation to a later one, they also showed that while Israel was God's central focus, even the Gentiles were made in his image. Genealogies can also be put to rhetorical work, revealing how one group of people is superior to another. Relatedly, in the context of various genealogies of Israel, Kip Davis writes that they can demonstrate ethnic lineages that ensured membership in the larger groups of clans and tribes. And far from being static, genealogies can evolve depending on socio-political factors. An example of such evolution can be found in a genealogy from 1 Chronicles chapter 7. In verses 20 through 29, we read of the descendants of Ephraim, beginning with the patriarch himself and concluding with arguably his most famous descendant, Joshua, the son of Nun. But this genealogy isn't merely a list of fathers and sons. In verses 21 through 24, we find some narrative detail that is unparalleled in the rest of the Hebrew Bible. Per verse 20, Ephraim's firstborn son is Shuthelah. The rest of verse 20 and most of verse 21 trace that lineage, ending with another Shuthelah, who is the great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Ephraim. Next, the chronicler lists two additional sons of Ephraim, Ezer and Eliad. At this point, the genealogy pauses, and a bit of narrative material is interjected. Here is the rest of verse 21 down through verse 24, as it appears in the NRSV updated edition. Now the people of Gath who were born in the land killed them, because they came down to raid their cattle. And their father Ephraim mourned many days, and his brothers came to comfort him. Ephraim went in to his wife, and she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Beriah, because disaster had befallen his house. His daughter was Sherah, who built both Lower and Upper Beth-horon, and Uzan-Sherah. If you are a casual reader of the Bible, all of this might not raise any alarm bells. This might just seem like some interesting color in an otherwise dull genealogy, but if you paid any attention at all in Sunday school, then you know that this pericope runs afoul of a pretty central story in the Bible, namely the flight of Israel from Egypt, the Exodus. Ephraim was the brother of Manasseh, and the two were Joseph's sons who were born to him after his brothers, fellow sons of Jacob, had sold him into slavery, but before famine wreaked havoc on Egypt and the surrounding region. After an emotional reunion with his brothers and father years later, Jacob blesses Ephraim and Manasseh, telling Joseph, "Your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are now mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are." This intra-family adoption not only establishes their legitimacy as heirs, despite their Egyptian mother, but it also functions almost etiologically as a way to place the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh on par with tribes like Judah or Simeon or Benjamin, by giving a lineage that terminates with Israel himself. Not long after all of this, Jacob dies, and Joseph arranges to have his father embalmed and taken to Canaan for burial. Jacob lived to be 147 years old, while Joseph, Genesis chapter 50 verse 22 reports, reached 110, a number with symbolic significance, as it was an ideal lifespan in Egyptian culture. Significantly, verse 23 says that Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. That is, Joseph saw his own great-grandchildren. This was possible not simply because of Joseph's advanced age, but because, we read at the beginning of verse 22, Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's household. That household, as we learned in Genesis chapter 48, now included the sons of Joseph. Consonant with this is that when we read of the tribes of Israel who have entered the land in Numbers chapter 1, we find listed the tribe of Ephraim and the tribe of Manasseh. The descendants of Ephraim, then, were part of the generation that lived in Egypt and later made their escape. The chronicler contradicts that. First, the chronicler reports in 1 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 21 that the people of Gath, who were born in the land, killed them because they came down to raid their cattle. To whom do these pronouns refer? The natural antecedents are that of Ezer and Eliad, sons of Ephraim. The fact that people from Gath killed them strongly suggests that this didn't happen in Egypt, as surely any Gathite incursion would have been repelled by Egyptian forces. Second, the chronicler writes that Ezer and Eliad came down to raid their cattle. Remember, it is Gathites who killed Ezer and Eliad, and so the language of going down means that the brothers must have dwelled somewhere to the north of Gath, and therefore not in Egypt. This contradicts what we know from both Genesis chapter 50 verse 22 and the implication of Numbers chapter 1 verses 32 through 35. Third, Ephraim produces another son with his wife, naming him Beriah, because disaster had befallen his house. Beriah has children of his own, and the chronicler highlights one in particular, Sherah, his daughter. According to verse 24, she is the founder of Lower and Upper Beth Horon, as well as Uzan Sherah. While the location of Uzan Sherah is unknown, Upper and Lower Beth Horon are cities known to archaeology. Importantly, they are in Canaan, not Egypt. This further situates Ephraim and his family away from Egypt, in stark contrast from the impression we get from reading relevant passages in the Torah. It is difficult for this amateur exegete to read the chronicler and not come away thinking that what he claims for Ephraim and his descendants stands in contradiction with what we find in the Torah. Nevertheless, a few readers have sought ways to reconcile what we find here with what we find in the Pentateuch. In his notes for the Jewish Study Bible, David Rothstein offers an overview of attempts to harmonize the Torah and the chronicler. Let's briefly go over them. First, he notes that in the Aramaic Targum and some rabbinic texts, we find the claim that the story in Chronicles suggests a group of Ephraimites left Egypt before the events of the Exodus, settled in Canaan, and were met with failure, a sign that they shouldn't have tried to play God. For example, in a section of the Babylonian Talmud, examining the Valley of Dry Bones from Ezekiel chapter 37, the question of the identity of those resurrected bones comes into focus. Who are they? The ancient rabbi, Abba bar Avo, referred to as Rav in Talmudic texts, reportedly said, "These were the descendants of Ephraim, who calculated the time of the end of the enslavement and the redemption from Egypt, and erred in their calculation. They left before the appointed time and were killed." Another option Rothstein mentions is related to the first one. In Exodus chapter 13 verse 17, we are told that when Pharaoh let the Israelites leave the land, God decided to forego a more direct route to Canaan in favor of a long cut because, the deity thought, if the people face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. The war in context is battle with the Philistines, since in the narrative they have control of the region north of Egypt. But in Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, we find a different explanation. And it was when Pharaoh had released the people that the Lord did not conduct them by the way of the land of the Philistines, though that was the near one. For the Lord said, "Lest the people be affrighted in seeing their brethren who were killed in war, 200,000 men of strength of the tribe of Ephraim, who took shields and lances and weapons of war, and went down to Gath to carry off the flocks of the Philistines. And because they transgressed against the statute of the word of the Lord, and went forth from Egypt 30 years before the appointed end of their servitude, they were delivered into the hand of the Philistines, who slew them. These are the dry bones which the word of the Lord restored to life by the ministry of Ezekiel the prophet in the vale of Dura, but which, if they now saw them, they would be afraid and return into Egypt." In this version of events, God does not want to take Israel to Canaan by way of the land of the Philistines, lest they see the dead bodies of Ephraimites who had apparently miscalculated when their period of enslavement was to end, and therefore traveled to Canaan too early, meeting their doom. Yet another option is that the words "born in the land" in 1 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 21 refers not to the residents of Gath, but to Ephraimites, and that the massacre took place in either the desert or in Transjordan, outside of Israel. This explanation can be found in the writings of the 13th century French rabbi David Kimchi, who, interacting with Talmudic sources, disagreed with his predecessors. He wrote, "In my opinion, the ones born in the land refers to the Ephraimites, because among the descendants of Ephraim, the text mentions the ones born in Egypt, that is, his sons and grandsons. As it says, Joseph lived to see children of the third generation of Ephraim. It says that the descendants of Ephraim, born in the land, whom he produced in the land, went down to the land of Gath to take their cattle, and the men of Gath killed them. Now, this took place in the wilderness. It could not have taken place in the land of Israel, because the text says, 'And Ephraim their father mourned many days. And Ephraim did not enter the land.' For the only ones who left Egypt at 20 years of age or more who entered were Joshua and Caleb. Therefore I say that this event took place in the wilderness or in the land of Gilead, with Ephraim still alive. For that is possible, because Machir, son of Manasseh, was among those who conquered the land of Gilead, and the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were, after all, born upon Joseph's knees." What proves this interpretation is that you find that the Ephraimites' numbers when they went out of Egypt, when they were counted in the wilderness of Sinai in the second year, totaled 40,500, whereas when they were counted upon entering the land at the fords of Moab, they totaled only 32,500. So those 8,000 whom they lost in the wilderness are the ones whom the Gathites killed. The logic of this harmonization is a bit hard to follow, and I'm honestly not sure I can fully wrap my head around it. The argument seems to depend in part on the idea that Ephraim was alive well into the Exodus, since, notes the rabbi, Manasseh's son Machir was alive during the conquest. In other words, they both lived extraordinarily long lives, allowing Ephraim to mourn the death of his descendants, some 8,000 in number. Still, another option for harmonization that Rothstein mentions is that the reference to Ephraim is a gloss, or perhaps refers to a different Ephraim, who was a descendant of his eponymous ancestor. This is the tactic of choice for Brian Kelly in his notes for the ESV Study Bible. Noting the presence of Joshua in this section, he argues that 1 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 21b through 24 refers to the post-conquest period. The building of Lower and Upper Beth Horon fits better with the time of tribal settlement. In this case, Ephraim would refer not to the patriarch, but to a later descendant of the same name. None of these attempts at harmonization are all that satisfying. For example, Brian Kelly's argument that the Ephraim of this particular genealogy is a different Ephraim seems to be little more than special pleading. The other genealogies in this section of 1 Chronicles seem to traffic in a fairly straightforward understanding of lineage. At the top of chapter 7, Issachar's sons are listed: Tola, Pua, Jashub, and Shimrod. This is consonant with Genesis chapter 46 verse 13. Ditto for Naphtali, though with some variation in spelling. The only reason to suppose that the Ephraim in 1 Chronicles 7 is different than the patriarch is because of a need to harmonize the accounts, not because the text itself warrants it. The same can be said of the idea that the reason Yahweh didn't want the Israelites to pass through the land of the Philistines was because they would see the corpses of their kin, the Ephraimites, who had left Egypt too early for the Promised Land. Nothing within the account in Exodus leads to that conclusion. This holds true for the notion that the reason there is a difference in the census numbers of Numbers chapter 1 and Numbers chapter 26 is because of a battle between the Ephraimites and Gathites. Such a reading ignores the context of Numbers chapter 26, wherein a new census is issued following a plague that wipes out a significant portion of Israel, including those of the tribe of Ephraim. What then do we make of this strange little story in 1 Chronicles? Rothstein offers another possible take on the passage, namely that perhaps there is no need to harmonize at all. Instead, this section is part of Chronicles' portrayal of the eternal bond between Israel and its land. And this, to my mind, is a much better way to understand it. The chronicler is writing sometime in either the 5th or 4th century BCE, before the reign of Alexander the Great and the end of the Persian Empire. The community to which he no doubt belonged had been one that knew the pain of exile. The holy city had been taken a century or so prior by Babylon, and its temple to Yahweh razed. With the cult suspended, and with many Judeans away from their homeland, there is no doubt that despair reigned. "The joy of our hearts has ceased," writes the author of the Book of Lamentations sometime during the exile. "Our dancing has been turned to mourning." But with the fall of Babylon and the ascendancy of Persia came the hope of restoration. Cyrus the Great had ordered not only the release of those in exile, but also the rebuilding of both the city of Jerusalem and its temple to Israel's God. What does this have to do with Ephraim in 1 Chronicles chapter 7? By depicting Ephraim, a member of Israel, as originating in Canaan, the land to which the Babylonian refugees were now returning, the chronicler was staking his claim that Israel was always in the land and that, fundamentally, no matter which way the socio-political winds blew, it was their rightful home. Yes, Yahweh had emptied the land by means of Babylon, but that was merely to let it rest in accordance with prophetic testimony. The people always belonged there, and the God of Israel was restoring them to their rightful place. Perhaps this is the reason that the chronicler downplays the Exodus and the conquest, beginning his narrative of Israel's history not with Moses in Egypt, but with the monarchy. While I find the idea that the chronicler is intentionally portraying Ephraim, and thereby Israel, as eternally connected to the land of Israel compelling, there is another option that Rothstein doesn't mention. In a piece for thetorah.com, David Frankel posits that the chronicler included this story about Ephraim and his sons due to oversight. He writes, "The editors of Chronicles incorporated various sources into their work without always examining them too closely, and included them even when these traditions disagreed with the author's main thrust. This may have been particularly true regarding ancient genealogical lists and their attendant anecdotes." He later writes that the editors of Chronicles have inadvertently preserved some ancient materials reflecting early conceptions that they did not intend to promote. Similarly, Stephen Toole writes concerning this passage, "The preservation of such an odd little nugget among the chronicler's sources reminds us of the remarkable diversity of Israel's traditions. The use of this narrative here demonstrates the chronicler's skill in weaving together a variety of sources and traditions." Of the various options for dealing with 1 Chronicles chapter 7 verses 21 through 24, the final two I've briefly discussed seem the least strained and therefore the most viable. Unless one is willing to engage in special pleading or radically reinterpret other texts to make the chronicler's work fit in with, say, the Torah, the best option is to let the text stand as it is and try to understand it in its literary context. Like those who try to harmonize disparate gospel stories at the expense of narrative details, those who try to fit the chronicler here with what we find in the Torah end up losing much more than they gain. That's it for this episode of Bible Study for Amateurs. I'll see you next time. If you'd like to support this podcast, share it on social media, subscribe to it on the listening platform of your choice, or head over to amateurexegy.com and click on the support button, or do all three. And most importantly, remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening.